high-stakes draft, the top priority remains the same, winning, and more specifically, winning money. And what better way to do that than by drafting a beauty? That's why you've got to check out our brand new draft kit at awesemo.com, created by experts who have profited over $7 million playing fantasy sports. These guys are going to help you crush your drafts this year with tools like the Draft Wingman that's powered by projections from the #1 ranked daily fantasy sports player in the world, Awesemo himself, and includes a one-of-a-kind recommendation engine that takes into account your prior picks to ensure a well-rounded team and optimal draft. Draft Wingman is also outfitted with best ball-specific recommendations, including our stack highlighting feature, which helps you complete your all-important best ball stack. If you're looking for more details, or maybe you're already down to join us for an incredible NFL season, click the following link and use the promo code WR, that's WR, to get the entire draft kit for only $9.95. We'll see you over there. We all know football season is the greatest time of year, but drafting season's a very close second. So whether you're drinking and drafting with your boys for your annual home league or preparing for your next high-stakes draft, the top priority remains the same, winning, and more specifically, winning money. And what better way to do that than by drafting a beauty? That's why you've got to check out our brand new draft kit at awesemo.com, created by experts who have profited over $7 million playing fantasy sports. These guys are going to help you crush your drafts this year with tools like the Draft Wingman that's powered by projections from the #1 ranked daily fantasy sports player in the world, Awesemo himself, and includes a one-of-a-kind recommendation engine that takes into account your prior picks to ensure a well-rounded team and optimal draft. Draft Wingman is also outfitted with best ball-specific recommendations, including our stack highlighting feature, which helps you complete your all-important best ball stack. If you're looking for more details, or maybe you're already down to join us for an incredible NFL season, click the following link and use the promo code WR, that's WR, to get the entire draft kit for only $9.95. We'll see you over there. Yo, you're watching the Awesemo Fantasy Football Channel. I'm Dave Lockren. With me, as always, Matt Gajewski. And today we're closing out the series with tight end tiers. We already did running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks. Check all of that out right here on the channel if you haven't done so yet. And then come back to it. Or watch this one first and then come back. Doesn't matter. The order is unimportant. What is important, though, is that we break all of these down and really basically touch on some serious strategy outside of just tiers as well. How are you drafting tight ends? How serious are the tiers when it breaks from Kelsey to Waller to Kittle, so on and so forth, into the later rounds of the draft, whether it's standard league, just redraft, PPR, super flex, whatever it is, and more importantly, best ball. So Matt, a lot to dive into today. It's not a position that everyone gets super excited about, but it's a super important position when it comes to how you attack it.
Yeah, it's probably the most nuanced position we have. If you just look at your standard 12-team leagues, your team with Travis Kelce has a significant advantage over that number 12 team who's maybe streaming week to week and getting 5 or 6 points. So where you draft some of the more valuable tight ends is crucial to these overall fantasy drafts.
No doubt. And I think it's important to point out as well that, you know, people look at tight ends and they say, I don't like drafting early tight ends. You know, they're just not as good. But you have to consider a couple of things here. Travis Kelce was the 7th best PPR producer in the league last year. And I'm talking running back, wide receiver, and tight end, not just pass catchers. Darren Waller PPR formats was 10th. So both of these guys were top 10 in scoring, not at their positions, of course, not even as pass catchers, but among all skill players. So I think, Matt, it's important to consider not just that these guys are legitimate elite wide receivers playing a tight end position, but also how scarce the position is at tight end compared to other spots. Whereas if you're landing one of the 2, maybe 3 elite tight ends in this league, you're, as you kind of put it right there, you're head and shoulders ahead of everybody else as long as the rest of your draft looks solid.
For sure. You basically have a wide receiver 1 in your tight end position. And we know from experience, it's much easier to fill the wide receiver.
Good morning. It is another, I don't know what word I just said. Another was the proper word. Awesome MLB Strategy Show. A lot going on today. We've got all kinds of stuff across the channel. We're covering NASCAR, MMA, and then we've got NFL preseason later, of course, baseball. So guys, do us a favor, subscribe to the YouTube channel so you get access to all this information. Also, if you have any questions about any of today's baseball slates, because there's a ton of them across the different FanDuel and DraftKings slates, leave us a comment and I'm going to be checking back in during the day to answer some of your questions. But first, Adam, how are you doing right now?
I'm good. Nice Saturday morning show. Didn't drink last night, so I'm feeling good.
Yeah, it's the slates are really confusing. I was kind of trying to figure out like how to set this up because FanDuel has different slates than DraftKings. And DraftKings has the early slate and they have the main slate. And they also have that 4 p.m. slate, which also includes the early games. So for now, the way I broke it up, it's the early slate, the main slate. But that's also why if you guys have questions about any of the individual slates, just leave a comment underneath and I'll be checking back during the day on the YouTube video and answering some of those questions underneath. But without further ado, let's get into the early slate, the first game here. It is the Yankees against the Twins. Garrett Cole on the mound for New York. And the first thing to talk about with Cole is he was coming off the COVID list last game. Didn't seem to have any sort of ill effects. Struck out a whole bunch of guys, kind of picked up right where he left off. So to me, Garrett Cole, who's going to be popular for the early slate, but justifiably so.
Yeah, no real issues for me. 10-6 on DraftKings is a perfectly reasonable price tag. He only threw 90 pitches in 5 2/3. That would be like the only minor concern, I guess. Like there's some chance that you get a Chris Sale situation where it's just like, yeah, okay, you're done. But I don't think that's likely. He only missed 2 weeks with COVID. 90 pitches is still, a decent amount. So it's pretty likely, I think, that he just gets back to his normal workload here. It's not a bad matchup against Minnesota. Their lineup is already out and it is not very good. Ref Snyder, Jeffers, Gordon, all in there. The only negative, I think, from a lineup standpoint for Cole is that this lineup doesn't have the most strikeouts. Luis Arias is a sub 10% strikeout guy. Williams Astudillo is nearly impossible to strike out. Andrelton Simmons is very difficult to strike out. And then even the guys at the top in Kepler, Polanco, and Donaldson are average to below average strikeout rates. So Cole's still going to get his because it's Garrett Cole. But the one negative, I think, is that there's a decent chance the Twins are able to just, put enough balls in play that you don't get an absolute ceiling start.
Yeah, and I think the only thing really here to consider with Garrett Cole is because I think that if you're playing in cash games, you're considering them at least. In tournaments, you're definitely rostering, you're playing multiple lineups. The real question becomes, and this is a DraftKings related question, not FanDuel, because Cole isn't on the FanDuel slate, but do you have a strong preference between Garrett Cole and Max Scherzer? Because we're going to have to talk about them kind of in combination with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're pretty similar. Like the matchup against the Mets is, in my mind, kind of comparable to the Twins, where they have some okay hitters, some decent hitters, but it's overall, it's a below average offense. Right now, we have Scherzer projected about 2 points higher than Cole. He's $300 more expensive. So I think I would lean, if I can get to Scherzer, I would lean him slightly ahead of Cole, but I wouldn't be making huge sacrifices to get there.
And then on the other side, it's going to be Kenta Maeda pitching for the Twins against the Yankees. Really, really risky spot for Maeda, although it's kind of hard to find cheap pitchers to feel decent about. And if you look at our tools today, by the way, top pitcher tool, that is free over at awesemo.com. Kenta Maeda only project for 3.7% ownership. And we have him with a 12.3% chance to be one of the top 2 scoring pitchers on the slate. And then if you look at some of the ownership with the Yankees, it's a team that's always going to be somewhat popular. So I can't say I feel great about rostering Kenta Maeda, but as this ownership currently stands, he's somebody I'd be getting to overweight to the field. Number one, because I think he serves a little bit of leverage off the Yankees. But then number two, also, there just aren't that many cheap pitchers to get to.
Yeah, agreed. It's just a low ownership pitcher play that has upside because Kenta Maeda is not a bad pitcher. He has exactly a 25% strikeout percentage this season, 3.94 xFIP. The Yankees lineup is dangerous, but there are strikeouts too with Judge, Stanton, Odor. Those guys strike out the bottom of the order with Velasquez, Higashioka, and Wade. Certainly isn't the scariest thing in the world. There's no Joey Gallo in the lineup today. So that's a plus in terms of likely production, at least. Obviously it does take a 33% strikeout percentage out, but Kenta Maeda does have a ceiling. He also is in a really risky spot. But when you look at the ownership projections on pitching in that price range, you have a lot of ownership going to Hyun-Jin Ryu against the Tigers at 30%. I think that makes sense. We'll talk about that when it gets to that game, but you're only getting 3% going to Kenta Maeda. I think he is one of the guys that you can use in that price range that you're not really sacrificing much in the way of ceiling, and you're getting a huge ownership discount.
Yeah, that's really the key thing for me. If his ownership was to come up and be like 12% or something, then I wouldn't feel great about him. But relative to some of the other pitchers in this price range, we have very low ownership going to Kenta Maeda, Logan Gilbert. I think they're both sensible. And, then you pay up a little bit. You got Luis Patino. He's picking up a little bit more ownership. And then Hyun-Jin Ryu, who, like you said, is certainly viable, especially for cash games and need salary savings, but he's going to be 30% owned in GPPs. So to differentiate, Maeda right now looks like he is my favorite pivot play.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly reasonable. It's just, it goes back to, when you're playing tournaments, you're not trying to guess exactly what someone does and like build a lineup that projects for the most points, because that's pretty easy to figure out these days, how to build the highest projected lineups. You're just trying to find places the field isn't, where you're not really sacrificing ceiling. Even if someone like Maeda is a little bit less likely to hit it than Ryu is, the ceiling is about the same for those guys.
Yeah, and by the way, I don't know what is in my throat right now, except it is making it so I just can't talk at all. But by the way, that's a terrible sign for me. I'm doing like 4 shows today, so if I can't talk at 11 o'clock in the morning, what is it going to look like at 6?
Better hope that hurricane hurries up.
Oh yeah, the best case scenario for me is the hurricane just gets here and wipes everything out. But I think Kenta Maeda, we both seem to be on the same page here. Low owned GPP option, viable. On the other side, the Yankees as a stack, they're fine. It's just that they're picking up a little bit of ownership today. Maeda is a serviceable enough pitcher that I want to be underweight to the field on them.
Yeah, it just kind of seems like the ownership's coming in around where it should. Like you said, Kenta Maeda is not a bad pitcher. For the season, he's allowed a 173 ISO to righties, but only a 147 expected ISO, 150 expected ISO to lefties. He's gotten pretty unlucky in terms of power overall this season. So Anthony Rizzo at 3,700 still stands out as a very good value. I think Rougned Odor batting 5th at 3K is a strong value. And then Voit at 3,300, same position as Rizzo. I'm guessing he gets less ownership, but he's a pivot you can make to get a little bit less ownership if you are going to the Yankees. But overall, I think just kind of a mediocre spot. Still a pretty solid lineup, even without Gallo and Sanchez, but not quite as strong as it normally is.
All right, next game we have here on the slate, it is the Tampa Bay Rays at home against the Chicago White Sox. And I think the first thing we really have to talk about here is the upside of Luis Patino compared with the downside, because we've seen a whole different kind of results of. There's sometimes he pitched against the Yankees, looks unhittable, Patino, and then he'll come out his next start and just unable to throw strikes and giving up a lot of hard contact. So we've seen him struggle against fairly weak offenses like the Twins, and we've seen him shut down the Yankees. So look at him today, very high variance play, tough matchup against the White Sox, 14% ownership, 13% chance to be a top 2 pitcher. I want to be on both sides of this.
Yeah, I also think it's worth noting that the White Sox have decided to replace Tim Anderson and Luis Robert with Jake Lamb and Danny Mendick. So I think that makes it a little bit more favorable matchup than normal for Patino here. It's a good park as well. Only a 4.2 implied run total for the Sox. Like you said, it's a really volatile pitcher. This is one of the top pitching prospects in baseball, but it's not unusual to see these guys come up, continue to strike guys out at a high rate. And we've seen that we've seen decent strikeout numbers from Patino, 22.7%, but he's also walked 11% of hitters. He's allowed 1.5 home runs per 9. Overall, he hasn't been very good, but we know the pedigree is there. We know the stuff is there. He has had some difficult matchups, and you are getting a bit of a watered down White Sox lineup. Patino only coming in at about 14% ownership. I think that's reasonable to get there. I don't think I'll be jamming over the field though, unless that comes down.
Yeah, and then on the other side, the Chicago White Sox, we have them projected for almost no ownership relative to their odds of success. So Chicago White Sox, 2.2% ownership compared to a 5.8% ownership share. Like I said, I think this is an upside spot on both sides. Patino has shown the ability to be really good, and then other times just kind of struggles. He's very young. He's one of the top pitching prospects in baseball, but a lot of variance here. So I think the White Sox are one of the teams that I really want to target for offense today.
Yeah, and the trade-off, I mentioned that they're missing Anderson and they're missing Robert, which makes the lineup less appealing. The trade-off is that you get some cheap guys in better lineup spots. Brian Goodwin hitting second at 3,500 on DraftKings. Andrew Vaughn in the lineup, 2,800 batting 6th. Yohan Moncada's salary is down to 4K. He hasn't had a great year, but that's still a pretty cheap salary for someone that has the tools that Moncada does. So you can stack this White Sox lineup for a bit less money than you normally could, only pulling about 2% aggregate ownership right now. And yeah, it's just a volatile spot where I think it's one of those spots where I think the median projection for the White Sox certainly doesn't tell the whole story, because there's so much volatility in Patino that when he's bad, he's still likely to be really bad. Like we don't really have like a narrow range where we can just say, yeah, like this is what it looks like when Patino doesn't pitch well. So far, we've seen when he doesn't pitch well, he pitches really poorly.
Yeah, and that's really what we're looking at here, is that there's a whole wide range of outcomes. If the White Sox were really popular and Patino wasn't picking up ownership, then I'd be like, hey, I want to embrace the variance and be over on Patino. So it's not necessarily predicting the results of this game and saying I think the White Sox are likely to go off. It's just they're low owned. There's a wide range of outcomes here. So I think they're sensible to get overweight to the field on. Now on the other side, Dallas Keuchel is going to be starting for them. We've talked about Keuchel quite a bit over the last, month or so at this point. And here's how I always feel about Dallas Keuchel. I never really want to roster him because he doesn't generate a lot of strikeouts, but he usually limits the damage enough. So I don't want to heavily stack against them. So the Tampa Bay Rays do look under-owned in our tools right now. 3% ownership, 6% chance to be a top stack. But even with that in mind, I don't think I'm going to be super high on this team just because it is hard to generate a whole bunch of upside against Keuchel.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a little higher on Tampa just because they are so low owned and they do have so much power in this lineup. Keuchel has had issues with right-handed power this year and he's not striking them out at all. You're right, though. I mean, like the most likely outcome here is that he gives up a couple of home runs and that you're best served by having, like a 2-man or a 3-man Tampa Bay stack. But because overall they're not getting ownership, I still think I'll get to some 5-mans. Just hope that they get to Keuchel early, hit a few home runs, get to the bullpen. They are just such a good offense too. Their active roster has a 116 WRC plus against or overall this season. Actually, I think that was against right-handed pitching. I'm going off memory, but either way, they're really good. Point being, this team hits the ball like crazy. They're good against everybody. It's just a really high upside offense, 0.2% ownership in a spot that I don't think is bad.
All right, the next game here, speaking of bad, we have the Chicago Cubs playing, and the Cubs, the Orioles, two teams that never really seem to win baseball games anymore, and the Cubs are going to be throwing Keegan Thompson out onto the mound today. 26-year-old, basically career minor leaguer, looking at his major league stats this year. While he does have a 2.21 ERA, most of those come out of the bullpen, so I don't expect we're getting very much length out of Keegan Thompson today, but how deep do you think he could potentially work into the game?
Yeah, I'm not expecting too much here, though he hasn't pitched in the majors since July 26th. So I'm going to pull up his minor league page to see if he's been stretched out there. But so far this year, only one start in the majors. And in his most recent appearance in the majors, he threw like 26 pitches. So based on that, I wouldn't expect much. His most recent outing in the minors, he went four and a third. He went four innings in the one before that. So I think, a 4-inning, 3 to 4 innings is a reasonable expectation. Not enough where I'm going to roster Thompson.
Yeah, and it's certainly with Keegan Thompson, I think that we have to look at his numbers and then also just kind of try to project like, okay, what kind of a pitcher is he? Well, Zips has him projected for a 5.65 ERA the rest of the season. Steamer has him projected for a 4.77 ERA the rest of the year. And you look at some of his minor league numbers, at least the last ones we have available to us. In 2019, well, actually, not very much in 2019, pitched a total of 10 innings that year, but 2018 in Double-A, he had a 4.06 ERA, 4.25 xFIP. There really isn't that much information on Keegan Thompson. And when somebody's this age, 26 years old, is an unheralded prospect that hasn't really made it to the big leagues, I just generally tend to think that probably not a real legitimate prospect. Looking at his fastball velocity, looks solid, 94.8 miles per hour, but once again, that's primarily out of the bullpen. So are the Royals a team you're going to be interested in stacking?
Yeah, I mean, with Thompson, like he did see a jump in his strikeout percentage this year up to 30%. There could be something there since we have basically a 3-year layoff, and that 3-year layoff coincides with all the, new technology in baseball and stuff like that. Maybe he's improved, who knows? But I still think that I'm more inclined to go to Kansas City. It's humid. The wind's blowing out in Wrigley. I'm with you. Like typically when guys are 26, 27 years old and getting their first crack in the majors, they're not very good, especially in his case. He was a 3rd-round pick. So that actually, I think, kind of worked. It makes me think less of somebody when they're this old and get a chance, because it's not like, they were like a 20th round pick that everybody just overlooked for years, even though they're doing really well. Like 3rd-round picks, teams typically try and get to the majors as quick as they can, and he still couldn't do it. So maybe he's better, maybe he's good. I kind of doubt it. Kansas City ownership wise is pulling a ton of ownership. That's what I think hurts their case here, because it is good hitting conditions. It is a pitcher that probably isn't very good. They're not very expensive. You have Salvador Perez at $5K, Merrifield at $4,400. Every other hitter in the lineup is $3,300 or less. So I do expect this team to be really popular, probably more so than they should be. I think they're very good plays. I think you look to them in cash games, but in tournaments, most likely will just be like limiting them to lineups where I'm on very low owned plays otherwise. Yeah. This is the type of team though, where like, if you're going to Kansas City, Kenta Maeda becomes very useful as opposed to like Hyun-Jin Ryu.
Yeah, that's a good point too, is that if you're rostering KC and then you're just rostering like Max Scherzer, Garrett Cole, cool. So is everybody else. So it's going to be pretty hard to differentiate. I'm just looking through some of the KC individual hitters and trying to see like, all right, is there any way that I could find some guys to differentiate towards the bottom of the lineup with ownership? Something I'll often like to do with a team that's pretty popular, but every single hitter in the KC lineup today is projected for over 10% ownership. So there's no real ownership reprieve here. There's no, even if you want to go to a crappy hitter like Emmanuel Rivera at the end of the lineup, he's projected for over 10% ownership today. Nicky Lopez, who's batting second and has hit, I'm pretty sure, 1 homer the entire season. He's 12% on today. It's really hard to find any kind of low-owned hitters in the lineup. So at least in the build I have right now, I am underweight for the field on every single KC hitter.
Yeah, that's how I expect to be as well. They're good values. They're good. They're in a good spot. Overall, they're not a really good offense, though. So, like, this is a little bit different spot than, like, for example, yesterday when we had the Yankees projected for a bunch of ownership. That was at least, or even 2 days ago on the smaller slate. It was like, those are a lot of really good hitters in good spots that are getting ownership. So it's a little bit scarier. Here, it's average to below average hitters, excluding Salvador Perez, in a good spot for sure. But typically this is the kind of spot where over the course of a season, if you're just not getting as much of them as the field, you're going to end up making more money than if you're just trying to, like, go overweight on a 15 to 20% on Kansas City team.
Yeah, basically, if you're rostering them, what you're saying is that you think this team has a, like, what's their owner? So 17.6%. You're basically saying that you think 1 out of 5 times or better that this team ends up being the top scoring team on the slate, which I frankly don't really think is the case because KC doesn't have a prolific offense. It's a good spot, but it's a pretty big slate. 9 games is a lot of teams to choose from. So to me, the Royals, it's not to say it's not a good spot for them because we just talked about, we don't think that Keegan Thompson's particularly good, but they're very, very popular today and probably more popular than they deserve to be. But on the other side of the game, the Chicago Cubs shockingly picking up a lot of ownership because the Cubs, a team that have been a massive underdog for pretty much all their games for last month. This one set at a pick'em game. But even with that said, 13.6% ownership for the Cubs, that seems absolutely crazy to me.
Yeah, I think you can kind of just run back what we just said about Kansas City. Like, Chris Bubich hasn't been very good in the major league so far. He's one of Kansas City's top prospects. Maybe at some point he'll be good. That hasn't been the case so far this season. He's only struck out 19% of hitters, 2.74 home runs per 9, 4.8 xFIP, and now he's pitching with the wind blowing out in humidity in Wrigley Field. It's a good spot for the Cubs without a doubt. Patrick Wisdom's 4,800. Every other hitter in this lineup, Bodie's 3,800. Every other hitter is 3,300 or less. So it's kind of the same thing. Frank Schwindel, 2,600 should get a lot of ownership, but he's a good value. And that's kind of the case for guys like Chirinos at catcher at 2,700 as well. But it's just like, there's still 16 other teams on this slate, excluding the Royals and the Cubs. They can do well from a point per dollar standpoint and get you a relatively high scoring lineup, but you still have to beat the other lineups that you're competing with in tournaments. So it goes back to it not being about, when you're playing tournaments, not being about saying, I think this is, the most likely thing to happen or exactly what's going to happen. You have to factor in the payoffs when those events do happen. And with the ownership that's projected to go to Kansas City and Chicago right now, the payoffs just aren't as high if you roster them and you're right than if you roster some of these other teams and you're right.
By the way, as we were talking about this game, the lineup came through for the Cubs. It is such a bad lineup on paper. I'm reading it off my phone right now. Ortega, Schwindel, Wisdom, Duffy, Bodie, Hayward, Chirinos, Hermosa, and then Thompson pitch spot. That is a really bad lineup. I don't know if there's a single guy in that lineup, maybe Patrick Wisdom, that I would project to have a WRC plus over 100 going forward. So it's a bad team that's picking up a lot of ownership, and that's always kind of a little bit of a red flag to me. But is that anything that might drive you to potentially want to roster Chris Bubich for low ownership in tournaments? I
was kind of thinking, as we talked about this game, like, I was kind of rethinking what I'd said about Keegan Thompson and about Bubich. Like, in theory, it makes sense because these teams are getting so much ownership. They're not very good team. They're not very good offenses. And if one of these cheap pitchers has a good game, you're eliminating a lot of the field. The issue is that hitter pricing has just been so weak lately that it's probably not necessary. Like, I think we saw it yesterday too. Like, there were some pretty good pitching options yesterday that you could get to if you needed to, but it was like so easy to make Chris Sale plus Robbie Ray lineups or Robbie Ray plus Sonny Gray or whatever. Like, you didn't even really need to do it. You were just basically giving up points for no reason just to be cute. I think that's probably going to be the same thing here where, in theory it makes sense, but once you start building lineups, you're probably going to realize that you're just giving up a lot of points. They're going to be difficult to make up.
Yeah, and the other thing too, Bubich is picking up a little bit of ownership. Thompson isn't, only 1% for him, but Bubich right now projected for 6.5% ownership. So at least in some respects, the field is getting to him. It's not like he's a totally unknown pitcher, even if he isn't all that popular. So it's pretty crazy to see that Bubich is picking up about double the ownership of Kenta Maeda right now. So
I also, if you're paying in that range, I think Reed Detmers is the best of the three. So.
Yeah, and we'll be talking about him later, starting for the Angels today against Cleveland. So pretty favorable matchup for him as well. And also another pitcher who's not picking up that much ownership. But a cheap pitcher is picking up a lot of ownership today. Someone we mentioned a little bit before, that is Hyun-Jin Ryu. He is at home today against the Detroit Tigers. For cash games, play Hyun-Jin Ryu. For tournaments, also play Hyun-Jin Ryu. I think the question just becomes, is 30% a number that's a little bit too steep?
It really just depends, like what the like if you're talking 150 max, it depends what the allocation to offenses looks like, really, because I think in general I'm more willing to go to popular pitching than I am popular hitting, just because it's more predictable, and it's only taking up one spot in your lineup. So I think that I probably get around 30% Ryu. I think that I'm going to be on enough low-owned teams like Tampa Bay, like Chicago, that we've already talked about, where I'm not going to mind taking a 30% on Ryu that projects really well against the Tigers. But if you're someone that, feels a little bit more strongly about Kansas City or about the Cubs and you want to play more of them than I do, that's fine. But your Ryu ownership or exposure should probably be dropping along with it, because if you're playing those teams, you're going to need to be finding some lower owned pitchers. So for me, I expect that I'll probably get around the field on him. I think his ownership looks correct given the value he offers, the matchup, the projection, especially on DraftKings where you have to roster 2 pitchers.
So for me, and once again, this is just my initial build I made early in the morning, and it's subject to change as we get more information, lineups come out and ownership is updated and whatnot. I'm fairly underweight to the field on Hyun-Jin Ryu. One of the main reasons is somebody you mentioned before, Reed Detmers. I was getting to in over 20% of my lineups. That lowered the amount of ownership I was getting to Ryu. I also was a little bit heavier on Tristan McKenzie just because of the ownership difference between the two. He's pitching in the same game as Reed Detmers. We'll talk about him later. So I don't have an issue with Ryu at all as a play. And maybe as we get closer to the slate locking, I'll end up being a little higher on him. But he's also pitched really poorly lately. Last 2 starts for Ryu, he scored -10 fantasy points against Boston, and then what should have been a pretty favorable matchup against Seattle last time out. He only scored 9 fantasy points. His strikeout rate's been down. He's not generating a whole lot of swing and misses. He's been a really high variance pitcher for the year, like in a crazy way. If you look at Ryu, all of his starts since, let's see, how far back do I have to go for this stretch? Like the last 2 months, all of his starts, he either scores 22 or more fantasy points or 10 or less. So he's been all over the place in terms of variance. With that in mind, I kind of don't mind getting the Detroit Tigers here. We've seen from Ryu some really bad starts as of late. He's going to be picking up a lot of ownership. I don't mind being overweight to the Tigers just because we've seen Ryu struggle even in some favorable matchups this year.
God, they're so bad though.
Yeah, they are. Remember when everybody thought the Tigers were really good, and we went through that month where they were really popular, and everyone's like, how can you not play the Tigers? And now nobody wants to play the Tigers. Now it's like Hyun-Jin Ryu, who's averaging negative fantasy points in his last 2 starts. He's the chalk of the slate just because he's going up against the Tigers. So listen, I totally agree that they're not good, but they're picking up 1% ownership, and they're going up against one of the most popular pitchers on the slate, who's not pitched well in a lot of these matchups lately.
Yeah, you can also even just go like Scope, Grossman, Cabrera, and I think get the job done. You probably don't even need to necessarily include the rest of the garbage in this lineup. But yeah, I'm with you. It's not a team that I expect to get a lot of, but they are projected to be a little bit under-owned, and they are facing a pitcher that is getting ownership. So I think it makes sense in large field tournaments. I don't think I'll get a lot. I don't want to get a lot. It's the Tigers. They suck. But it just goes back to the payoff thing that, I mentioned earlier. If you have the Tigers, they're still a major league offense. They still are going to have some good games. Ryu's going to have some bad games. The games where the Tigers go off, you're going to make a lot of money, or you have a better chance of making a lot of money that if you have them, than if you have a team like Kansas City or the Cubs and you're still competing with, 15% of the field.
And we did just get the Tigers lineup as the 2 games in a row. We've been talking about a team, and the lineup comes up as we're talking about them. Hill, Scope, Grossman, Cabrera, Candelario, Castro, Short, Garneau. I'm just going to throw this out here. Miguel Cabrera hits his 500th home run today. That is going to be my home run pick of the day. Am I super confident in homers today? No, but I'm going to be overweight to the field on him, so might as well pick him to homer. But once again, Ryu for cash games, certainly consider him, especially at his ownership. If you need a save salary pitcher, there's nobody who's safer in the cheaper price ranges in SP2 on DK. But for tournaments, I'm going to be underweight to him personally. I'm also going to be stacking the Tigers a little bit. On the other side of the game, Willie Peralta is going to be starting for the Tigers. The Toronto offense clearly in a good spot, but also, once again, a massively popular team. So another team in the Blue Jays who I think they warrant some ownership. I'm just not willing to get to the 17+% field as that.
Yeah, typically in spots like this where it's we have them as the clear top offense on the slate, but also being overowned, I still get to them typically. Like I'll get a little bit below the field or on some hitters, around the field, depending what position they play and how easy it is to get them into lineups, because it is still, a really good spot. And like, these are guys I'd rather mix popular Toronto hitters into lineups than popular, like Kansas City hitters, just because the Toronto hitters are so much better in terms of their actual abilities. So I'll still get there, but yeah, they are projected to go a little bit over-owned here. Peralta started off kind of decent this year, but he's dropped off as expected. Only a 12.8% strikeout percentage against righties, 18.8 to lefties. He's only allowed a 124 expected ISO to right-handed hitters, but again, this is a pretty small sample this season. So I'm still certainly giving the edge to these Toronto bats in Rogers Center.
Yeah, it's hard not to. Also, it's a favorable hitters park. They finally have a home park now. They're back playing in Toronto, but it's a little bit too much ownership. But this isn't a team that's going to be an outright fade for me. It's just kind of slightly over-owned, and I'm still going to be rostering a lot of these guys as one-off. So if you're going ahead and stacking Blue Jays, I don't have an issue with it. I'm just not going to be playing in like 20% of my lineups or anything. Next game here that we have to talk about, Eric Lauer on the mound for the Milwaukee Brewers going up against the Washington Nationals and Paulo Espino. Eric Lauer, to me, serviceable MLB starting pitcher. I just rarely ever end up rostering him due to his lack of strikeout upside. Going up against the Nationals is going to be a very favorable matchup. We've talked about a lot how ever since the trade deadline, they're basically Juan Soto, Josh Bell, and a bunch of replacement level players. But Eric Lauer also a little bit of a price tag to him at 8,600 on DK. He's also picking up ownership. Just not a play I have interest in. Yeah,
the ownership's the issue for me. I kind of thought I was going to look at an $8,600 Lauer at like 5% and have to come to the realization that I was going to have a decent amount of Eric Lauer today, but he's pulling 12 to 13% ownership. Like, that's the same ballpark as Patino. It's more than Sean Manaea. Granted, Manaea's in a tough matchup, but also just a better pitcher. I think it's about where it should be. Like, I'll probably come in, around 10% on Lauer because it is a good matchup. He's got a 22% strikeout percentage this season, which on this particular slate is not horrible. But it's just not a spot where I'm expecting to really get over the field there either. I think they're just about where they should be.
Yeah, and then on the other side, Nationals, not a team that I'm going to have interest in. Is that the same for you?
Yeah, that's the same for me pretty much every day. The exception, of course, is Juan Soto and Josh Bell, but also Victor Robles if he's leading off at 2,200. I really wish DraftKings would kind of just like accept that teams like the Royals and the Cubs and the Nats suck and stop pricing these guys to their actual talent level and start pricing them to like where they're going to hit in the order.
Yeah, we've seen this now. And that's one of the reasons also that the ownership has been driven up by a lot of the ace starting pitchers lately. It's not that hard to get to Garrett Cole and Max Scherzer both on DK together because there's so many cheap hitters available to us when we have the Washington Nationals. Like, hey, half their lineup is min price, and you could take a couple of those guys. Not that I make a 5-man stack of them, but it makes it easy enough to pay up for pitching. So it's definitely been something we've seen really change ownership over the last month and a half now or so. But then on the other side, Paulo Espino is going to be starting for Washington. He's somebody who, like you said, he's gotten off to, or kind of similar to what we said about Willie Peralta. Espino got off to a good start earlier in the year. He's tapered off a little bit lately, but the Milwaukee Brewers are not really picking up ownership today. So relative to some of the numbers we're looking at right now, I think the Brewers are my number one overall favorite stack on the slate.
Yeah, Milwaukee looks really good to me too, which has been the case a lot recently. It hasn't worked out. Anybody that caught the show yesterday where I talked about Houston, that worked out really well. So maybe you want to wait until I'm not on Milwaukee, but I'll be going back today. They're projected for like half the ownership they should get. Essentially the same top stack percentage as the Dodgers, 2 and 3. But you have the Dodgers getting twice the ownership. They're getting like 1/4 the ownership of Toronto. And this is just a team that gives you upside in a variety of ways. They have a bunch of guys that they're not elite stolen base guys, but they'll run when given the opportunity. They also have power. There's not a lot of value here. Like, Yelich is really expensive. Escobar is really expensive, but you do have Tellez and Kane priced down, assuming they're in the lineup. If you do need a little bit of savings, obviously Al Garcia has been great this year. Willie Adames is really good. I like the Brewers. I think they're a little bit overpriced, but there are those mid-range pitchers. Whether you're going to Ryu, you can certainly use Ryu with a Brewer stack with the way their ownership's projected. You can use Maeda. I think that where the ownership is sitting right now, Milwaukee looks really good.
Yeah, my in my initial build I have here, my most rostered Milwaukee hitter is Colton Wong. He's projected for 7% ownership. Also is a fairly modest price point of 4,500, will likely be leading off. So he's somebody else who is reasonably priced and somebody I'm going to be getting to a decent amount, it looks like, as long as the ownership doesn't change. So like you said, they are really expensive, but there are some cheaper pitchers that we have at least some interest in that are under-owned, and Brewers the price tags aren't driving them off for me too much just because the ownership isn't there. So I think this is a good pay up spot to be contrarian. That is right now my favorite overall stack on the slate. Next game here, it is Max Scherzer at home against the New York Mets. We talked about Scherzer a little bit in comparison to Garrett Cole. I don't really think there's too much to add here. Play Max Scherzer today.
Nothing else to add. Like the Mets are an okay team as far as if Max Scherzer doesn't have his good stuff or like anywhere close to his good stuff, they have good enough hitters they can do damage. They're not like the Marlins, but other than that, there's nothing really negative to say about Scherzer. 10,900, but like you said, there's just so much good value or just value in general on the slate that it's not going to be difficult to get there. Through 94 pitches his last time out, went 6 innings. I don't think there's really any reason to be concerned about how deep he's going to go into the game. So yeah, I think Scherzer is a slight number one for me, but if someone disagreed and said it's Cole, I'm not going to argue with them. I think it's perfectly reasonable. Clearly the top 2 pitchers on the slate though.
Yeah, for sure. And then also, like we talked about, when you got teams like the Washington Nationals where half their lineup is min-price, it's not that hard to take 1 or 2 of those guys, throw them into a lineup, and all of a sudden, hey, I have the salary to pay up for whatever pitchers I like. So Scherzer, not all that difficult to get to today. Garrett Cole, not all that difficult to get to today. It is viable to build lineups with them together. And I think that is something that's going to pop up in a lot of my lineups today. I'm going to be pretty high on Scherzer and Cole for this slate. On the other side, Rich Hill is going to be on the mound for the Mets. He's been a really tough pitcher to figure out this year, although I think for DFS purposes, we can mostly write him off for a couple of reasons. Number one, tough matchup against the Dodgers. Number two, we just don't see Rich Hill pitch deep into games at this point in his career.
Yeah, brutal matchup. And like you said, just not going deep enough into games that I really want to roll the dice on him anyway. There's enough low-ish owned pitchers in that price range. 3 2/3 last time out for Hill. Only gave up 2 earned runs in that start. 3 innings to start before, 5 to start before that, but still only threw 80 pitches. It's just not a spot where I would like to get to Hill. Like it would be so surprising if he suddenly just throws like 90 or 100 pitches or something.
Yeah, and the other thing too is he's had a really quick hook where if he struggled early, we've seen him come out. So there's a whole bunch of reasons I don't think there's enough upside to get to him. On the other side of the game with the Dodgers, they're a neutral play to me. We have about 8.5% chance to be or 9% chance to be a top stack, 8.5% ownership share. I'm probably going to be somewhere around the fields with the Dodgers. The only thing I'll say about this is we do have very similar top stack odds with the Dodgers compared to Milwaukee. And Milwaukee has about half the ownership. So if I'm paying up for an offense and I'm trying to weigh the ownership, just the Brewers come out looking a lot better to me than the Dodgers.
Yeah, like it's still a good spot for the Dodgers. They're still a really, really good offense, but I don't really think there's any reason the Dodgers should get double the ownership that Milwaukee's getting. The only thing that I can really point to is that for one, there's a little bit more name value on the Dodgers. And for two, they're a little bit less expensive. Like I think that typically people, if they're given the opportunity to either pay $5,000 for Omar Narvaez or pay $5,200 for Will Smith, they're probably going Will Smith. Same thing with, Seager at $4,900 versus Adames at $5,900. It's just a little bit better pricing on the Dodgers. Turner's $1,000 less than Escobar. So I think that's why you're seeing the ownership go there. They are going to be a little bit easier to get to. But I think they have very similar chances of success. I think Rich Hill is a better pitcher than Paulo Espino. I think that the Brewers aren't quite as good offensively as the Dodgers, but they do still have a lot of upside. So definitely paying attention to the ownership projections between the two. I would like to get overweight on both if, like, say the ownership on the Dodgers just comes down a little bit. Right now, I think I get to the Dodgers, but I still get to more Milwaukee.
All right. The next game here, 2 quality pitching options on the mound in Sean Manaea and Kevin Gausman. However, in the build I made, I'm just not really getting to either of these guys. Gausman's picking up a little bit of ownership, and he just has not had that much upside over the last month. We've only seen him score over 18 fantasy points once since July 11th. So Kevin Gausman, who's still pitching okay, but one of the big issues we've seen with him is that his control has been a little bit suspect in recent starts. And also something that you brought up, I can't remember if it was last start or 2 starts ago. It's probably been multiple times now. We've seen Kevin Gausman not work like 100+ pitches in a lot of his outings recently. So something else that's capped the upside of Kevin Gausman is we've seen some starts. It's like, hey, he comes out at 80, 85, 90 pitches. Is that something that's still a concern for you?
Yeah, I think it's kind of twofold because for one, like you said, the walks have gone up recently. And by recently, I mean, basically since they stopped with sticky stuff. But so for one, that's going to drive up his pitch count and limit the innings. But then also we've seen him just be taken out at relatively low pitch counts. Going back 2 starts ago, you had, he's pulled after 5 innings, 87 pitches against Arizona. He was pulled after 5 innings against the Mets, 94 pitches in that one. That at least makes a little bit more sense. But he hasn't thrown 100 pitches in a game since July 11th. That's going back, looks 5 or 6 starts for him. So that is a little bit concerning. Then you factor in that this A's offense is very good. They certainly can drive up his pitch count. They have a lot of just good, powerful hitters on this team. I think it's a pretty difficult spot for Gausman. And then he's also pulling ownership here. I kind of thought that with him at 9,500 and how much cheap hitting there was, that maybe you would just see even more ownership going to Scherzer and Cole and Gausman coming in at, 5 to 10%. But we have him at 15% right now. I think if it holds there, I don't think I get too much Gausman. I think I kind of just end up ignoring that price range and either getting up to Scherzer, Cole, or going down to the guys like Maeda, Patino, Lauer, whoever, whoever you want, Ryu in that price range. So the way it looks right now, ownership wise, I think I kind of just end up ignoring this salary.
Yeah, and then on the other side, the Oakland A's, they're not picking up that much ownership. I'm not really dying to stack them. I get that Kevin Gausman, we haven't seen quite as much fantasy upside from. He hasn't pitched very deep into games as of late, but he's still not somebody I'm dying to stack against. So the Oakland A's, I don't think they're going to be a team I'm prioritizing, even if they do look a little under on the top stack stool. But how about for you? Is Oakland a team that you might be looking to get to with Gausman being a little bit popular?
Yeah, I mean, the way it looks right now, I don't think I'd get to a lot. I do think Gausman's ownership pushes them up a little bit, but not get like 15%, still not a crazy amount. Oakland's one of those teams where I'm always willing to go to them. Like if they end up being a team that I get over the field on, I'm never upset about it because they have so much power. But on this particular slate, the way it looks right now, I don't think I end up really prioritizing them. It's just a difficult spot. Gausman I still think is good. The hitting conditions aren't good. The park isn't good for hitting. So I still think that there's some low owned spots that I'll get to before I start going to teams like Oakland.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I feel about the Giants on the other side too, where Sean Manaea is going to be pitching, and the Giants another team we don't have picking up very much ownership today. It is the American League, so they get the benefit of a DH, but I'm not really dying to stack them against Sean Manaea, although I'm not really looking to play Sean Manaea either. So kind of this entire game, it's offenses that I think are good to the point where I don't want to rush the pitchers, but the pitchers are kind of good to where I'm not really looking to target the offenses.
Yeah, that's where I'm at too. I think Oakland looks a little bit more appealing than the A's do. Just they have a 5% chance of being the top stack, only getting about 2% ownership. But the issue you run into, and we've mentioned it with San Francisco a lot, is that they're going to run out this lineup full of right-handed hitters that are good, and then eventually Manaea is going to come out of the game. And at some point, you're going to have whoever's on the bench, whether it's Dickerson or Yastrzemski or whoever, start pinch hitting. And we don't know who they're going to pinch hit for, but it makes it a little bit riskier. It's still a good value on someone like Austin Slater leading off at 2,500. I think Bryant and Posey are good. Darren Ruff's cheap at 2,600. So I think the Giants are my preferred option in this game, but I still don't think I get to a lot of them.
Yeah, so the issue that I also have, and something you brought up there and something that we talk about a lot with the Giants, is just on a salary basis, my two favorite plays in the lineup are Austin Slater and Darren Ruff. The odds of both these guys getting pinch hit for are very high in this game. So it's something that also makes it kind of tricky for me, where it's like, all right, I'm getting 2, maybe 3 at bats against Sean Manaea. Then he comes out of the game, and then these guys come out of the game also. It's not like Manaea presents a great matchup. So I mean, in the stacks I made of the Giants today, just kind of running through fantasy just building it, Darren Ruff and Austin Slater come out in almost all of those stacks, and I just don't know how optimal that is. So it's just going to be some manual adjustments I have to make. It's stuff that's kind of hard to pick up on data, but the Giants' odds of being a top stack, while they are true, the individual hitters' odds kind of get thrown off because these guys are probably not going to be in there the whole game. So it's something I always struggle with. I don't really know what the right answer is. So maybe just playing a little bit of Slater and Ruff as one-offs because they still have the same home run upside. So I think that kind of makes sense. But overall, this is a game that there's a lot of talent here. I just don't think I'm going to be all that interested in it.
Yeah, I'd feel differently if the slate were a little bit smaller and all the teams I like were getting considerably more ownership. But right now, I mean, you can point to these other teams like Tampa Bay is getting 2 to 3%. Chicago's at 2 to 3%. Houston's at 4%. I don't know. I think I get to those teams before I start getting to this game.
All right. The next game, this is a really interesting pitching one to mention. These are two pitchers that I'm overweight to the field on. The Cleveland Indians against the Los Angeles Angels. Tristan McKenzie, Reed Detmers. You mentioned Detmers. You liked him earlier as a cheap option, isn't picking up all that much ownership. Tristan McKenzie, another guy who was great in his last start. A lot of variance to McKenzie because he's a young pitcher with terrific stuff, but sometimes the command just isn't there. He struggles to throw strikes, but just based on the strikeout upside, I'm overweight to the field on Tristan McKenzie in just about every single start he has. I think that he makes for an excellent pivot off of Hyun-Jin Ryu. And Tristan McKenzie, by the way, his last time out, nearly pitched a no-hitter, ended up going into the ninth inning with a no-hitter, ends up pitching 8 innings, 11 strikeouts, no walks, just 1 hit. So His strikeout to walk ratio has looked much better as of late. The last 3 starts, 20 strikeouts, just 1 walk. I want to be overweight to the field on Tristan McKenzie. Reed Detmers, I also like him as a value option. But first, let's talk about Detmers because you brought him up earlier. How do you feel about him as a cheap pitching option? And, well, I already know you like him, but how about why do you like him?
Yeah, kind of the same points you were making for Tristan McKenzie. It's just he's a really, really volatile pitcher. He's Fangraphs has him as the number 36 overall prospect in baseball. He made 12 starts at AA this year, 54 total innings, struck out 43.1% of hitters, made 1 start at AAA, also struck out 40% of hitters. Steamer projects him for 9.9 strikeouts per 9 innings, 4.4 FIP. He's got really good stuff, and the upside is certainly there. He's had a really, really difficult stretch of games to start his major league career. Major league debut was against the Athletics. Then he faced the Dodgers. Then he faced the Astros. Struggled in the first 2. Went 6 innings with 6 strikeouts against the Dodgers. The Astros rather. Only gave up 1 earned run. That's he's got really good stuff. And then now Cleveland's still not a cakewalk matchup. Like he's going to face an entirely right-handed lineup. Ramirez and Reyes obviously are good, but they're not on par with teams like the Astros, the Athletics, and the Dodgers. So I really like the ceiling that Detmers gives you. Like you just can't find this kind of strikeout stuff at this price point that often. He's not getting that much ownership either. Not sure how often you'll need to go down to this price range, but I do think if you are looking to pay up for teams like Milwaukee or the Dodgers or them together or something like that, like Detmers is one of the ways that you get around the Cubs and the Royals. Instead of saying, okay, I'm just going to play Scherzer and Cole and all the Royals and all the Cubs, you say, okay, I'm going to sacrifice one of those guys, pay half the salary for Detmers, and hope that the actual good hitters on teams like the Dodgers and the Blue Jays and the Brewers outscore teams like Kansas City that aren't actually good offenses. So I like that approach, at least, in theory. Again, I haven't built lineups with how much hitting value there is. It might not be necessary, but Detmers does at least give you actual raw point upside. It's not one of these guys where you're saying, oh, well, he's not going to strike anyone out, but maybe he goes 5 innings and he, 3X's his salary. He can legitimately go out there and strike out more than a guy per inning and have an actual good start here.
Yeah, and the other thing too with Detmers, talking about the strikeout upside and his pitching, his accolades as a pitching prospect, his numbers in the minor leagues this year from a strikeout perspective are pretty ridiculous. 43.1% K rate in AAA, 40.9% K rate in AAA. I have those reversed, so it is a 43.1 in AA, 40.9 in AAA. Limited sample size for him, but still, that's pretty promising stuff. At the big leagues, we haven't seen that bear out yet, but he's only pitched a total of 15 big league innings. If you look at his projections on Steamer and Zips the rest of the year, they project him out as a pretty good strikeout pitcher at the major league level. So Reed Detmers, to me, given what his price is, I personally had him over double the field in the first build I did. I had him right around 25%. So to me, Reed Detmers, he is my favorite cheap pitching option. We're just looking to totally punt the position. I think he's a good option to go. And then the other side with Tristan McKenzie, he's pitched so much better as of late. And that's also something that you had brought up when he first got called up to the big leagues. Was it about a month ago, where start of the year in the big leagues struggled with his command. They sent him down. At the time, Cleveland said that, hey, we think we fixed these command issues. I don't totally buy into that because we've seen him walk guys at times, but he seems to be on a better stretch with his control right now. And once again, a really high variance pitcher who's not picking up ownership.
He's walked more than one guy once since in 7 starts since coming back from the minors. So I'm with you. Like, I'm always skeptical when teams are just like, oh yeah, we fixed it. When it's a guy who's had these issues his whole career, like maybe you just flipped the switch and finally figured it out. I typically tend to think that it's more likely that he just has kind of put some good starts together and you think you figured it out. But he has, since they said that, he's really just stopped walking guys. And either way, from a DFS standpoint, I don't really care. Like, I mean, obviously, if I knew for sure that he wasn't going to walk guys, I would think he's a lot better. But even if this isn't a long-term fix, I don't care because the strikeout stuff is still there. He's not getting a lot of ownership, and he's reasonably priced in an okay matchup against the Angels. Ohtani's a really difficult out. Walsh is a good hitter. Both of those guys still strike out. Upton strikes out. Marsh, Adele, Stassi, these guys all strike out a lot. So I'm more than happy to go right back to Tristan McKenzie today, as long as he's not projected for much ownership.
Yeah, and once again, we haven't projected for single-digit ownership today. If you guys want to check more of that out, Top Pitchers tool, that is free today over at awesemo.com. 28.2% K rate for Tristan McKenzie at the major league level this year. If you look at his minor league numbers, he's always struck out a bunch of guys in the minors. I think he's going to be a guy. There's going to be some growing pains. He matches the eye test, though. He has really good stuff. And yeah, I think that he's somebody who, as long as he's low owned, I want to be on him. If there's ever a slate where he ends up being like 30% on, I'm probably going to want to stack against him. But the way this is currently shaking up, I want to be on him, and probably higher than Ryu for me.
In his 7 starts since he came back from the minors, he's averaged 6 innings per start. He's struck out 24.7% of hitters. So the strikeout percentage is down, but he's only walked 4.3%, 4.11 xFIP. Like he has looked like a legitimately good pitcher, even if the strikeouts haven't been there. Like maybe he did sacrifice a little bit in terms of strikeout upside to be able to control where the ball's going. But so far it's worked out. He's had some home run issues, but other than that, everything looks really, really good for him since he came back.
All right, final game of the early stretch of games. Then we'll talk about the smaller main slate for tonight. But Houston Astros at home, Jake Odorizzi against Logan Gilbert. First, let's talk about this Houston Astros offense because they're going up against Logan Gilbert, who I think is a pretty quality starting pitcher. But this is the Astros offense. They're capable of hitting anybody. So 4.1% ownership share on them, 5.6% chance to be a top stack. I think there's a case to be made that both Gilbert and the Astros are going a little bit under-owned, but I don't really think that makes anybody a priority play for me here.
Yeah, I agree with that. Gilbert has not been quite as good recently as he was to start the year. He's had some tough matchups, faced Tampa Bay, faced Toronto, faced Oakland. Also had a couple starts against Texas where he was fine. So it's possible that, maybe he's just kind of hitting a wall, but he is also one of the top pitching prospects in baseball. Overall this year, he's had success, 26.9% strikeout percentage, 3.94 xFIP, 1.16 home runs per 9. I'm with you. I think that there's just a lot of upside here. And it's one of these spots like we get with the Red Sox a lot where the median projections for everyone kind of just aren't that great because Logan Gilbert's good. The Astros are good. The median projections are kind of going to say that like neither one does really well, but there's so much talent on the Astros and Logan Gilbert himself is so talented that there's actually going to be a lot of games if you played this out 1,000 times where the Astros just light him up and end up being a really good stack, or he just has his A+ stuff and dominates the Astros because he has that kind of stuff. So I do think both sides are pretty appealing at their current ownership levels in tournaments. Gilbert getting 1% on DraftKings, the Astros getting 4%, but like you said, neither one is someone that's likely to jump up to where I'm like, oh, I have, 20% Astro stacks or I have 25% Gilbert or something like that.
Yeah, and then on the other side, Jake Odorizzi, who I'm kind of surprised is picking up some ownership today. Not a ton, but 8% ownership for Jake Odorizzi, about a 7.5% chance here to be one of the top scoring pitchers on the slate. It is a favorable matchup against Seattle, but Odorizzi hasn't worked very deep into games recently. We've also not seen him pitch all that well recently. So I look at him as a pitcher, once again, not a priority for me. I'm looking at other pitchers who are cheap that we've already talked about. I'd rather get to Detmers. I'd rather get to some other guys like even Ryu, even though I'm not massively high on him. I'd rather play him certainly than, not high on him, I'd say relative to ownership. I'd still rather play him than Odorizzi. I'd rather pay McKenzie than Odorizzi. So as far as SP2s go on DK, I think Odorizzi just not all that appealing to me at 8% ownership.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ownership makes sense. Like he's getting about where he should be. He's 7K. He's not a very good pitcher. The Mariners are capable of making some average pitchers look good at times. I don't really have a strong take one way or the other on Odorizzi. I do actually like the Mariners, though, as sort of a pivot to Kansas City and to the Cubs because they have Seattle is only projected for about 3.5% ownership compared to the Cubs at 13%, compared to Kansas City at 17%. The Mariners still have almost a 12% chance of being the top value stack. That's not too far behind Kansas City and Chicago, who are both around 15%. So getting a fraction of the ownership, not too far behind them in terms of top stack percentage either. It's not a bad matchup against Odorizzi. The hitting conditions aren't as favorable as they are in Wrigley, but Kyle Seager, I think, would probably be the best hitter on the Cubs and possibly the Royals. JP Crawford's cheap leading off. Mitch Haniger is probably the best hitter on either team in the Wrigley game. So you're getting just better hitting here and still really cheap price tags. Cal Raleigh, if he's in the lineup, is a $2,100 catching option. Jared Kelenic, has had his struggles since coming up, but still one of the top hitting prospects in baseball, basically minimum salary. I think if you are looking to go that pay up for two pitchers approach, I would rather go to the Mariners from an ownership standpoint than the Cubs or the Royals.
Yeah, it makes sense. There's not a single hitter here who's more than 5% owned. And it's, Mitch Haniger, Jake Fraley, these guys are both around 5%. And then Kyle Seager, arguably the best hitter in the lineup. He's only 3% owned right now. So certainly a low owned team. They are looking under owned in our top stacks tool. So I don't have an issue with that at all, as them being a cheap team to get to pay up for offenses. To Jake Odorizzi, as somebody who's rostered Jake Odorizzi a little bit at really low ownership lately, I don't have interest in Jake Odorizzi anymore, especially not when he's getting to be a little bit more popular. So that wraps. What was that? Oh, no,
I was just saying, like, it's kind of when you look at, there's 4 teams right now that have at least a 10% chance of being the top value stack on DraftKings. Kansas City getting tons of ownership, Cubs getting tons of ownership, Minnesota facing Garrett Cole. then you kind of just have Seattle, who's not facing a very good pitcher and isn't really getting ownership. So to me, that just looks good.
All right, that is going to wrap up the early slate. The main slate coming up next, and that is just a 5-game slate. But first, we've got some bills to pay. So let's go over some of the other information on the YouTube channel. There's a whole bunch of stuff coming up on the Awesemo YouTube channel, guys. So like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, because today we've got NASCAR, we've got MMA, and I'm going to be back doing MMA also. Also be back doing MLB later in the day. And then we also have NFL preseason live before lock. You want to check out all of that stuff. Also, if you're interested in playing NFL DFS this year, which I assume is a lot of you guys, if you're going to sign up for the NFL package, if you know you're going to, do it now. We do have an early bird special going on. If you use the promo code BLITZ, you get 25% off our Awesemo annual package. So if you're going to sign up, do it now, because you get the discount right now. It's something that's not going to be available as we get closer to the season. So that is promo code BLITZ. That'll get you 25% off your Awesemo pass for the entire football season. Also, we have a new college football podcast, Betting You. That is going to be with Ben Rossa and Matt Gajewski. Go check that out on whatever platform you listen to podcasts, Google Play Store, Apple, Stitcher, all of that. Ben Rossa and Matt Gajewski, Betting You. That'll be covering all of the college football games and all the betting action. So if you're interested in college football and betting on it, go check that out. All right. Now, the main slate for tonight, just 5 games, so a little bit more of a compact slate. And that's also some of the slates where I feel like ownership plays even more of a role than on some of the bigger slates. First game here, Matt Harvey, the Dark Knight, returning, and pretty disappointing overall results for, in my opinion, the last time out, just because he was somebody who had no ownership. I was on him, pitched excellently through 3 innings. I was like, all right, Orioles, let's get Matt Harvey out of there, because it's only going downhill from here. And then he gives up like a triple, 2 singles, a couple of homers. It's like, all right, he is now just at a neutral fantasy game. But overall, Harvey has pitched better as of late than he did earlier in the season. I am finding it pretty tough to go back to the well in this spot against the Braves, though.
Yeah, I don't think I end up getting there. Like, it's probably not going to be necessary on this slate, but it is a Coors Field slate. There's not much in the way of cheap pitching. There are guys I think I like a little bit more though. So yeah, Harvey, you can make the case too, because Atlanta's likely to get a good amount of ownership, but and it's only a 5-game slate, but there's nothing really that points me to Harvey. All I really can say is that I do think he's better than people give him credit for. Not that I think he's good, but he's just, I don't think he's the total gas can that people make him out to be.
And we do have a super chat here we just got from Sam Bennett that I want to address before we carry on talking about the Atlanta Braves and the merits of stacking their offense, because he said, with so many games locking late, what is your strategy with late swapping, since you can't filter at lineups? Swaptimizer, low randomness. I don't really change anything. I do think that kind of these slates are nice though, meaning the early slate where it's the 1 to 4 p.m. A lot of the 4 p.m. games, we're not going to have the lineups, and that's going to create for some kind of weird ownership. And if there's players who are in the lineups for the later games that normally wouldn't be, a lot of times we see those guys with almost no ownership, but there's not something specific I do in Fantasy Cruncher to change my strategy when there's later locking games we don't have the lineups for. I still just kind of look at the data and look at the lineups as is, but is there anything that really changes for you, Adam?
I mean, it's really dependent on the exact situation. Like, when I have time, the first thing I do is just kind of like global swap where I can. This outfielder is out, this one's in. If I can global swap, that's great. So I try and do that, because that'll help to maintain my stacks. It's difficult with MLB because you have to maintain your stacks, but you also it's a pain in the ass for sure. So that's kind of the first thing I do. If I have time, then I'll go through and if the replacement player was really inexpensive, I'll just kind of manually upgrade where I can. If I do have to just kind of quickly mass late swap in Fantasy Cruncher, I will put in just the ownership, either the actual ownership or the ownership projections, and just set some cap on my teams or on my max ownership, so that at least Fantasy Cruncher doesn't start giving me crazy popular teams that I would have never played originally. But yeah, in general in MLB, it's kind of, I think, a lot more difficult to just have one set, yeah, this is exactly what I do and it takes me 2 minutes, than you would in NBA or something like that.
Yeah, where it really gets tricky is with positionality after lock, because it becomes really hard to keep a 5-man stack together when all of a sudden it's hey, I had this team, I had a 5-man stack, but now nobody's starting. That's shortstop viable. Right. Some of those becomes the issue. So I generally try to make only 5-man stacks on DraftKings, but some of these situations, the one thing I'll say, I'm more willing to play 4-man stacks, because sometimes that's just the only option. So that's really the one thing that I'll say I change about my strategy, is if I just don't have other options, I'm okay with making 4-man stacks instead of 5-man stacks. Yeah. But
One other thing in Fantasy Cruncher, you can also like if there's one team that really just kind of screwed you over, let's say let's just use the Giants as an example because for some reason that's the first one that came to mind. Let's say you had Brandon Crawford in 15% of your lineups and he's not playing and there's no shortstop that you can swap him to, but you still want those Giant stacks. Just go in and highlight all your Brandon Crawford and then like all your Brandon Crawford lineups, set it so that you can only 5-man stack the Giants, recreate all those lineups. It'll tell you which ones you weren't able to do because you'll still have Brandon Crawford. Then you can go look at those and say like, oh, well, does a 4-man stack work? Or was it a 3-man? You can kind of just go through a few times and just get all the Crawford out while maintaining your Giants, either mini stacks or full stacks.
Yeah. And once again, it's not something that like overarching change my strategy. Like, oh my God, the game started later and I have to totally overhaul my process. It's still just kind of wait and see what the information is and then adjust to it. But the one thing I'd say, be more willing to be flexible with your lineups. If you don't have, strict, if you play on FanDuel and you have like 4 stacks, it's okay if you don't have the optimal correlation. You just want to be able to, at some point, get guys that are actually good plays and are playing into your lineups. But overall, I wouldn't change too much. But getting back into the main slate now, the Atlanta Braves are my favorite stack of the slate. And while we have them as under-owned, it's not that they're not popular. It's that there are a bunch of popular offenses on this slate. We have the Braves, the Rockies, the Red Sox, the Diamondbacks, the Cardinals. These are all teams that are projected for about 15 to 17% ownership. But of the group, we have the Braves projected with the highest stack odds. So to me, Atlanta is my highest priority stack of tonight's slate.
Yeah, same. I'm a little concerned that the ownership's just going to be high. Like again, we kind of underestimated it yesterday, and I wouldn't be surprised if it happens again. Just because I think that people tend to just flock to hitters against the Orioles, and so I think we might just kind of naturally come in under projecting teams that face the Orioles. I think that's possible. So I do still like Atlanta. It's still clearly a high upside spot. Harvey, while I think he's okay, is still certainly capable of giving up runs to this team, and the bullpen's still not good. But I do think there's a decent chance Atlanta ends up being the highest owned team tonight.
Yeah, it could be. And right now, in terms of ownership, it's kind of splitting hairs. It's not like there's a massive ownership gap between any of those teams I mentioned before, the Cardinals, the Diamondbacks, the Red Sox, the Rockies, or the Braves. It's just we have the Braves right now projected to be the top stack of those teams by somewhat of a margin. One thing I will add about yesterday's slate, though, is the Braves were kind of expected to be a low-owned team yesterday, and then we get to lock, and oh my God, the Braves are super popular, and they end up sucking. So this is a good spot for them against Matt Harvey. I don't expect the same thing to continue, even if Harvey's been a little bit better as of late. Still getting up hard contact. We've seen this home runs start to pop up and rear its head a little bit lately, but I think that's really what I look at here. But is it something you think the Braves can end up being much higher than 15% owned as a team?
I could see, yeah. I mean, that's kind of the thing is right now they have the highest top stack percentage by enough where I'd be surprised if they become like negatively leveraged, even if they end up being, like 18% owned instead of 15, like they would still project well. So, and that's kind of how I felt about them yesterday too. Like I wasn't completely sold that they were going to be as low owned as we thought, but there was such a gap that I didn't really care. Like they could be even higher and I still would have played them. Like I wasn't mad that I had them yesterday. Well, I am now because I know how the game went, but even when I saw their ownership yesterday, I was like, oh, well, that's disappointing, but I still would have played plenty at that ownership. That's how I feel about them here too. Like I'm still going to play them a lot, even though I wouldn't be surprised if they just end up pulling a little bit more ownership.
All right. And then on the other side, Drew Smyly is going to be on the mound for Atlanta. Now, Smyly, the main issue I have with him is just the price point. Like, I don't understand why he's priced all the way up to 8,200 on DK. I think there's a case to roster him against Baltimore. Baltimore doesn't have a great offense. Smyly only picking up 9% ownership. I just wish he was a little bit cheaper, which, I mean, obviously anybody I would like to roster, I wish they were cheaper. I never say like, hey, I like this guy to be more expensive. But the 8,200 price tag on Smyly doesn't make all that much sense to me. But still, I think there's some upside in him. And the Braves are also going, the Orioles, I should say, are going a little bit overowned. So to me, if I had to play one side of this game, I lean towards Smyly.
Yeah. I don't know. I kind of like the Orioles, even though they are, like you said, they're going a little overowned, but Smyly does give up power. The Orioles do have it. 165 expected ISO to righties this year, 265 to lefties. They don't really have, I mean, Mullins looks good. Other than that, it's going to be like all right-handed hitters here. I agree. Smyly does have some upside, but I think he's pretty expensive too. Getting 9% ownership, I guess, is relatively low for the slate. So yeah, I'm with you. Like I can see getting some Smiley, but I do think it's a good spot for the Orioles. Mullins at 4,900, I think looks good even at the elevated price tag. Mountcastle, Hayes, Mancini. I like both sides here. Yeah,
it's once again the Smiley versus Orioles side. I don't actually like either side in just the grand scheme of things. But I could see a little bit upside in the Orioles offense, but I think there's also a case made an upside for Smiley. It's just Orioles right now project for 9% ownership. So we'll see where that settles. I think that there's still a lot of shuffling that could happen. We have a whole nother baseball slate. Then there's a whole other night set of games to come up. So 7 hours until the slate locks. I'm going to be on MLB Live Before Lock today. I'm pretty sure with Gundacker, although earlier start time today because we have MLB Live Before Lock, MMA Live Before Lock, and then the NFL preseason Live Before Lock. But yeah, I think as it stands right now, I would be underweight to the field on Baltimore. I know you said you like them a little bit, but are you going to be overweight to the 9% field ownership?
I'd expect to be around there. Probably more so just using like mini stacks than one-offs, because I do think that there's a pretty good chance you get a couple home runs out of the Orioles here.
All right. The next game we have here to talk about, the Boston Red Sox at home against the Texas Rangers. Eduardo Rodriguez on the mound for Boston, Jordan Lyles for Texas. So starting with the Eduardo Rodriguez side of the game, I've been fairly high on Rodriguez for a while now. The underlying stats do look much better than what his actual ERA is for the season. Arguably, Eduardo Rodriguez, despite the ERA, is having one of the best years of his career. Strikeout rate looks great. Walk rate, that's also by around a career low. So the 9,500 price tag for Eduardo Rodriguez, he is going to be popular today at 45%, but a pretty high priority play for me.
Yeah, I think so too. Just combination of really good matchup and really good pitcher. You and I have both talked about him a lot, that pretty much all the underlying numbers suggest that he's gotten really unlucky this year. You've seen him start to put some good starts together. 29.1% strikeout percentage, essentially the same as Aaron Nola. It's actually the highest on this slate. It's higher than Musgrove. 3.31 xFIP is better than Nola this season. It's better than Musgrove. It's you could argue at least that Rodriguez is actually having the best season of any pitcher on this slate, and he gets to face the Texas Rangers.
Yeah, and I mean, not too much else to add here other than that Rodriguez is a good spot. The Rangers don't have a good offense. Texas as a team surprisingly pick up a little bit of ownership. So even if you wanted to make a case for them for leverage, we have the Rangers with a 4% ownership share, 3.6% chance to be a top stack. So this doesn't really look like a great spot to get to them. Yeah,
agreed. Just not really a spot that I want to get to. I think individually, if you look to like Adolis Garcia, that's okay. Kiner Falefa, Hernandez, at the top to get a little bit of leverage against Rodriguez, that's fine, but it's just not something that I'm likely to be prioritizing.
All right. And then on the other side, Jordan Lyles starting for the Texas Rangers against the Boston Red Sox. I can't consider rostering Jordan Lyles here. He's not picking up any ownership. He's 6,200, but this Red Sox offense is so solid that still, I think that this is a spot would be, to me at least, too much downside to really want to roster Jordan Lyles here. Not enough strikeout upside. The Boston Red Sox as an offense, it's just another team that kind of goes in that group of the higher owned teams on the slate that are also in good spots. Cardinals, Diamondbacks, Red Sox, Rockies, Braves, just to reiterate, those are the chalky popular stacks on the slate, and then nobody else other than the Orioles really picking up much ownership. Boston looks about fair to me, 14.5% ownership share, 15.7% chance to be a top stack. Given what our current data is, my number one favorite stack is the Braves, but the Red Sox come in second.
Yeah, and one I think favorable thing when it comes to stacking the Red Sox, and this depends on what the actual lineup is, but most likely they're a team that you can just stack like any part of the order and still get plenty of upside there. So it makes it a little bit easier to not just have like a mega chalk Boston stack. Looking individually at their ownership, you're getting 20% projected for Schwarber and Devers, about 15 for guys like Bogarts, Verdugo, Vasquez, and Hernandez. But then you're still getting JD Martinez, Hunter Renfroe, and Jarren Duran at like 9.5% or less. Those are still guys that have plenty of upside that aren't getting a ton of ownership. Get a couple of those guys, mix them in with the, Devers or Bogarts or whoever. And you still have, for a 5-game slate, a stack that's not really that popular and is in a really good spot.
All right. Next game on the slate, 3 left to talk about. It is the Cardinals. It is against the Pirates. And Dylan Happ on the mound for Pittsburgh, Jay Happ on the mound for St. Louis, 2 fairly awful pitchers. But here's where I stand with the Cardinals offense is, once again, we have 5 fairly popular teams on the slate, and the Cardinals are one of them. Here's the issue I have with St. Louis. We have them projected for an 18% ownership share today, the most popular on the main slate. But we have them with a 9.2% projected odds of being the top scoring team. So with that in mind, of the teams that we have that are expected to be somewhat popular today, the Cardinals are the most popular and they have the lowest chance of being a top stack. Considering that information, this is one of my least favorite teams to target tonight.
Yeah, agreed. They're just not like they're cheap. The matchup against Peters is fine, but it's kind of the Kansas City / Cubs thing from the original slate or from the early slate. I think Arenado is a good play. I think Goldschmidt's a good play. I think O'Neill is a good play. Pretty much the entire lineup you can make a pretty strong case for with a 5.5 implied run total and cheap bats against Peters. But it's also just getting a lot of ownership. And so typically, I'll mix those guys in a little bit, but I'm going to be more inclined to go to teams like the Red Sox and the Braves.
Yeah, and the other thing too is you look at the St. Louis lineup and the projected ownership for these guys. There is no spot that's lower owned. Every single hitter in this lineup is projected for 12% or more ownership. Tyler O'Neill, 26% owned. Tommy Edman, 23% owned. Cash games, these are excellent guys to look to today. They're much too cheap. It is a good spot for them, but it's also too much ownership for me in tournaments. I'm going to be getting to some of these guys as one-offs. I just don't envision I'm going to get as much ownership as the field because everybody here is popular, and there's other spots I'd rather get to when we talk about some of the teams with higher odds of probability of being a top scoring team on the slate. So if people are going to roster the Cardinals, I'm not going to say it's a bad spot for them. It clearly is. It's just more ownership than I think is warranted. But on the other side of the game, Jay Happ is going to be on the mound for the Cardinals, and he's certainly a pitcher I don't think is particularly good, but he is picking up all kinds of ownership. 40% ownership going to Happ. That is absolutely crazy to me. Just based on that, I kind of want to stack the Pirates for leverage.
Yeah, not sure if the holy shit I just said came through on the mic or not, but that was the first time I looked at Happ's ownership because I was going to say, it's a good spot for Happ. I like him at 7,600. I guess I'll get there. And then I looked and he's 40% owned. That is pretty, I understand it. It's a good spot for Happ. The Pirates suck. Happ isn't good, but it's a 5-game slate, whatever. But man, that's a lot of ownership for J Happ. I'm with you. I mean, it's a smaller slate, so the opportunity cost isn't quite as high as you'd have on bigger slates. The Pirates aren't any good, but individually, Brian Hayes isn't bad. Brian Reynolds is good. Moran, Polanco, Stallings, they're not the worst hitters. And anytime you can stack against a 40% J Happ, I think it makes sense.
Let's see. How many times this year do you think he scored over 20 fantasy points? More than I thought, but it's still not a significant amount. So J Happ has scored over 20 fantasy points 5 times this year out of his 22 starts. And he has scored negative fantasy points about the same amount of time. So this is a guy in J Happ, a whole wide range of outcomes. On the whole, he's been very poor this year. He has a 6.03 ERA, 5.59 expected ERA. This is just a real classic case that we've got a stoppable force against a movable object. And I don't think the Pirates are any more likely to have success here than J Happ, but just considering the ownership, Happ is going to be so ridiculously popular. I mean, like you just said, 40% ownership. So we've got a pitcher over 40% ownership going to Joe Musgrove, Eduardo Rodriguez, J Happ. I can't get to that kind of number just based on my process, how I go build lineups. I'm going to be fairly high on the Pirates just because of that. And the other thing too is I don't have to worry too much about the ownership of the top end guys, Joe Musgrove and Eduardo Rodriguez, if I'm stacking the Pirates, because nobody's stacking the Pirates. So I think that's a pretty reasonable way to go. I'm going to be fairly overweight to the field on the Pirates. Not that I feel good about Pittsburgh, but J Happ's 40% owned, and I don't think that too much other thought has to go into it. Yeah,
and to be clear, I think J Happ is the best mid-range pitcher if you're just saying, who do I think has the best game? But, again, I think this is a situation where there's always a difference to me, and it comes back to chances of success versus ownership. There's always a difference between, is someone like Jacob deGrom getting a ton of ownership? I don't really want to stack against them anyway because they're just really good. But on a slate like this where there's just not much mid-range pitching, that always is going to force up the ownership on some guys who really aren't that good. In this case, it's J Happ. He's most likely going to have a good start. The Pirates are bad. I think Happ is probably better than them, but he's just still not very good. If there were other options, nobody would look at this and say oh yeah, I'm going to play J Happ in 40% of my lineups. It's just that they don't want to go to Coors Field essentially. So I don't think it's a particularly high likelihood the Pirates do well, but I think that they are under-owned. I think Happ is over-owned. So I will get there and then just bitch on Twitter when Happ scores 38.
And listen, talking about the Coors Field game, how nobody wants to get there. Who is going to want to get there? Me. I don't mind the spot for Kyle Freeland at all. I would rather roster relative to ownership Kyle Freeland than J Happ. I mean, Kyle Freeland's only 5,700 today, 7% ownership projected right now compared to that over 40% number for Happ. So we've got Freeland at 1,900 less salary. It's not like the Diamondbacks offense is all that daunting. We've seen Kyle Freeland pitch well in a lot of Coors Field games this year. I don't mind getting to the spot at all, that kind of ownership. If I'm saving money at pitcher, give me Kyle Freeland before I get to Happ.
Yeah, I think both sides of the Coors game, Gallen as well. But here's so keep in mind, Freeland pitches his home games in Coors. Actually, I can just get his Coors numbers. It'll be easier just the way this is set up for me. But the point here being, so Freeland, pitches half of his games in Coors, give or take. He has a 19.1% strikeout percentage this year. Happ's at 17.3%. Freeland's allowed 1.39 home runs per 9. Happ's allowed 1.8. Happ has a 5.3 xFIP. Freeland has a 4.46 xFIP. I get that Happ is facing the Pirates and he's not in Coors, so yes, the spot is better. Explain to me how it's 5 or 6 times better though.
It's not.
And you're also paying $2,000 more for Happ.
Yeah, and I think for the year, I don't even think this is controversial. Kyle Freeland's been better than Jay Happ this year by a pretty wide margin.
100%.
Like you said, Jay Happ is picking up way more ownership. He's also $1,900 more expensive. To me, the only thing here that's getting to people is the Coors Field game. And obviously that matters. But, we've seen Coors Field games. Not like every single one of them is guaranteed to go for a whole bunch of fantasy points. So this spot against Colorado where the Rockies, not that I don't want, with the Diamondbacks, not that I don't want to roster Arizona, but they're also a little bit overowned. We have them with 17.2% ownership share, 14.3% chance to be a top stack. So not as overowned as the Cardinals, but there's a little bit too much ownership going to Arizona. So I'm going to be rostering them less than the field. And I probably want to get to Kyle Freeland in like 25% of my lineups or so.
I have Freeland's numbers specifically at Coors this year in front of me now too. 35.2 innings pitched. Strikeout percentage is higher than Happ's. Walk percentage is lower than Happ's. xFIP is better than Happ's. Fewer home runs per 9 than Happ. Again, yes, Happ has the better matchup and he's not pitching in Coors. If you had a 50-50 bet on who has a better game, it is clearly J Happ. But Kyle Freeland's a better pitcher at a cheaper price tag at lower ownership on a slate where there's not a lot of cheap options and J Happ's pulling 40% ownership. Give me some Kyle Freeland.
Yeah, I'm going to be there. And then on the other side of the game, Zach Gallen, I don't really mind him either. It's obviously uncomfortable to roster pitchers against the Rockies offense at home. As bad as their offense been on the road, they have had some success at Coors Field, mostly due to the park factors. They've also been a much better team record-wise at home this year. But Zach Gallen's a pitcher who, once again, only project for 14% ownership. He's 7,200. And I think Zach Gallen's actually a pretty solid starting pitcher. The Rockies have a very bad offense on the whole against right-hand pitchers. So the Rockies, once again, it's Coors Field. It's a small slate. They're fine to get some shares of, but I want to be overweight to the field of Zach Gallen.
Yep. Same here. I mean, Gallen has a 26.7% strikeout percentage this year. Yeah, he's had some issues. He's allowed 1.6 home runs per 9. He's walked 10.5% of hitters. It can get really, really ugly if he's going to put some guys on base in Coors Field and then be, prone to either balls in the gap or home runs. It can get really ugly, but he's not expensive. The Rockies as a whole aren't a very good hitting team. Of course, they're better in Coors. Everybody would be, but it's certainly a lineup that can go out there and fail. And Gallen, again, just not a bad pitcher, not getting much ownership. I would just, you talked about Drew Smyly before, and I kind of was, on the fence about him. When you compare all these guys to Happ, I think in tournaments, rather, cut Happ's ownership in half or something and just allocate that 20% to being overweight on guys like Smyly, Gallen, and Freeland.
Yeah. I mean, that's where I'm going to be at too, especially relative to this ownership. And then once again, I think it's funny. If you look at the ownership right now, we have all this ownership going to J Happ, and every single pitcher that's priced below him, I kind of think is better than him, with the exception of being like Matt Harvey. And Harvey's pitched better as of late, but Freeland, Lyles, Smyly a little more expensive. Gallen, all these guys are better than J Happ, and I think even most of the field would agree, and then just go click on Happ's name anyway. So Coors Field game, I'm like I said, I'm going to get a little bit of exposure both the offense, but relative to ownership, I'm higher on the pitchers. Yeah,
I mean, the Happ thing really just comes back to the Pirates are that damn bad, and the game isn't being played in Coors Field. So I get it, but I think it's also just blown completely out of proportion right now. And yeah, the offenses in Coors are fine. I think it's still Coors Field. It's still a 5-game slate. You're going to have ownership going to teams like the Braves and the Red Sox and the Cardinals. That's going to pull it down on Coors Field. So I don't mind getting to those teams around the field either, but I think the bigger edge, like if you're just pointing to one thing here and you're saying like, I'm making one tournament lineup, am I better off playing, stacking one of these offenses or going to the pitching? I think there's a bigger edge on the pitching in Coors Field today than the hitting.
All right, final game on the slate, and then the show is going to be wrapped. But two pretty important pitchers also for the slate: San Diego Padres against the Philadelphia Phillies. Joe Musgrove on the mound against Aaron Nola. Now, starting with Aaron Nola, because I think that he is kind of the key pitcher in this upper price range. Because Joe Musgrove, Eduardo Rodriguez, these guys are both going to be about 50% of the field's lineups. Only 27% ownership going to Aaron Nola. Very tough matchup for him against the Padres, especially because Fernando Tatis is back in the lineup. But relative to ownership, I think there's a case to be made to get kind of similar exposure to Joe Musgrove, Eduardo Rodriguez, and Aaron Nola. We have them all projected very similarly. Just the only real difference between them is the ownership. So Aaron Nola, how much of a priority is he for you for tournaments at lower ownership?
So one thing before I get to that, one thing I had meant to mention before, and Sean V actually reminded me in chat because he said that Gallen struggled recently. He's also had just a brutal schedule recently. Going back, San Diego, San Francisco, Dodgers, 2 starts against the Cubs, San Francisco, Padres, Brewers, Giants. So also keep in mind that the numbers Zach Gallen's been putting up, he actually hasn't been facing many teams as bad as the Rockies. So one more reason kind of to feel good about Gallen, I guess. As far as the Phillies Padres game, I don't remember your specific question anymore.
Oh, yeah. So it was just, in short, Aaron Nola, where does he rank for you as a starting pitcher? How much do you want to get to him in tournaments when you consider that while it's a riskier matchup, he has much less ownership than Musgrove and Rodriguez?
Yeah, I think that the ownership discount you're getting in tournaments compared to Musgrove makes Nola pretty appealing. I don't really think it's debatable that Nola is a better pitcher than Musgrove. He's similarly priced on DraftKings, only $800 more expensive, and he's getting about half the ownership, give or take. If it holds like that, I think I end up coming in a little bit over on Nola, a little bit under on Musgrove, but it is definitely a scary spot for Nola. And also, I think worth mentioning that for years now, Nola has been just much better in Philadelphia than outside. It's one of those things that it's weird because Citizens Bank is a hitter's park, but you also just have pitchers that, they kind of get the mound set how they want it with the grounds crew at their home park, and they're comfortable there and whatever. So I do think it's at least worth mentioning that Nola's numbers outside of Philadelphia for years haven't been as good as at home.
Does that make you want to get to the Padres at all today?
Given their ownership, yeah. Like they're only getting 3.5% ownership. I think that they are just kind of too good of an offense to be pulling that kind of ownership. The only teams that are getting similar ownership on this slate are the Pirates, the Phillies against Musgrove, and the Rangers. So, I think the Padres look like they're probably the best, the most talented offense that you're not competing with a bunch of other teams if they do well.
Yeah. I think that it's a 5-game slate, so it's hard to write off any one offense. They're not going to be a high priority for me, but in lineups that don't have Nola, I'll probably get to the Padres a little bit. And then talking about the other side of the game, Joe Musgrove on the mound. I don't even know what to say about this guy. He faces a good team and he looks lights out, and he faces a crappy offense and he sucks. He's the most difficult pitcher to figure out in all DFS, and I'm never on the right side of him. I don't know that anybody could possibly be on the right side of Joe Musgrove. Here's just some of his recent box scores. Last time out, he was in Arizona against Diamondbacks. Great spot on paper for Joe Musgrove. He scores 0 fantasy points, 0.05 to be exact. Pitches 5 innings, gives up 6 earned runs, allows 10 hits, only generates 4 strikeouts. The start before that, whatever, favorable matchup against Miami, pitches really well, scores 27 fantasy points. This guy is all over the place. I never know what to make of him. He's really popular. So my general feel is when Joe Musgrove is this popular, I just want to be underweight to the field on him, and I'll prioritize Nola and Eduardo Rodriguez a little bit higher. It's not to say that I'm not going to get to Musgrove, but he's 50% projected ownership now, and I'm probably more likely to be somewhere around 30.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I view it too. I don't know what to make of Musgrove. I don't really think anyone does. He's been all over the place, was really, really good early in the year. Dropped off once they started banning stuff. He's still had some big starts since then, but they typically have needed teams like the Rockies to be the opponent. So I think he's really, really volatile. I still think he has good stuff, and he's certainly capable of going out there and throwing a gem, but I just don't think he's very reliable. Like I feel so much better about rostering Eduardo Rodriguez at 50% ownership against Texas than I do Joe Musgrove here against Philly. If the ownership were to come down and get, if you flip the Nola Musgrove ownership, then I'm saying, jam in a bunch of Musgrove, get underweight on Nola. Right now, the way it looks with Musgrove being projected for more, I'm saying, get more Rodriguez, get more Nola, get more of those other cheap pitchers we talked about, and I would expect to be underweight on Musgrove if he's 50% owned.
He's the most difficult pitcher to predict. Like baseball hitters are always going to be high vax, but as far as pitchers go, I think Joe Musgrove has been the widest range of outcomes guys this year because you never know. Just some days he looks absolutely lights out, and then other days like, oh, he pitched against the Diamondbacks and he's given up 4 runs in the first inning before he's recorded out. All lineups with him are dead. So he's been really tough to figure out. Tournament purposes when he's popular, I'm going to tend to be underweight to the field on him. And that's pretty much it. We'll see where the ownership ends up lying later in the day. And we'll have more information on that on MLB Live Before Lock. That's coming up later in the day. We also have the NASCAR Strategy Show, NFL Live Before Lock, MMA Live Before Lock, all kinds of stuff on the Awesemo YouTube channel. So guys, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and check out all of the rest of the content we have today. Good luck.